Hi, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Glad to be talking on this episode with artist, author Arlen Schumer. Arlen, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the show, and thanks for jumping on and talking with me about the worlds of creating and pop culture today.
Wow, thanks for having me, Jason. It's great to be here.
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
nice to
Glad to
meet
have you.
you.
Glad to meet you as well. I will also say you are something of a pop culture historian because I know you have the silver age of comic book art, uh, 1956 to 1970 to talk about. I know we have some Twilight Zone work to talk
Yeah.
about. There it is. Yep, there it is.
Have everything at your beck and call, as they say.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you're also a freelance illustrator. So if you don't mind, give us a little background about what you do in that world and what's drawn you into these creative directions.
Wow. Well, I guess I would say I have kind of two careers. One as a freelance illustrator who works in a comic book style. And then
Hmm.
the other side of me is the comic book and pop culture historian. I'd say my three main areas of pop culture history are comic book history, of course, itself, and
Hmm.
then the classic Rod Serling Twilight Zone television series, and the music and career of Bruce Springsteen.
Yes.
And
Yeah. Hmm.
so those are my main areas of pop culture interests that I do lectures, webinars, books about. And then there's the livelihood I've made for most of my professional life as a freelance illustrator, working in a comic book style. I've never actually worked for the comic book companies. A lot of people look at my art and they assume I've worked for DC and Marvel, but I never really have. What I've done though, I'm an historian of their works, but
Hmm. Hmm.
I've done in the same way Roy Lichtenstein brought comic book art into the fine art gallery museum world. I wanted to bring good comic book art into the commercial art, illustration, graphic design world,
Yeah.
because that was my background actually in art school. Rhode Island School of Design was graphic design, which ironically I went to RISD because of Walt Simonson, the great comic book artist who came
Yes.
out to RISD when I was in high school. And in fact, it's the 50th anniversary of the first appearance of his work next week, which I'm going to be doing a webinar on, but I'll tell you about that later. But yeah, so those are my twin careers. I've tried to bring comic book art into advertising illustration, product illustration, character design for companies, for an editorial message. And that's been the bulk of my professional career. And
Hmm.
then what I guess I would say was my avocation became I've been lecturing professionally since 1988. I've been published as a writer and as an author. Actually, that was my first professionally published article for the graphic design trade magazine Print in
Nice. Nice.
1988 to get them to commit to a special issue on comics.
Uh-huh.
Because comics are graphic design, they're words and pictures. Our whole society, books are words and pictures, or not
Hmm.
necessarily pictures, but often with pictures of some type, even if it's just a book cover. How
Yeah.
many have read books? Again, you don't judge a book by its cover, but sometimes we buy books or comics absolutely for their covers. One
Hmm.
of my recent webinars was on the great James Bama, who painted all those Doc Savage paperback covers with the science fiction Widow's Peak. To me, the greatest heroic male imagery in not just pop culture, but I think in the history of art. I would pit those Doc Savage poses, those heroic masculine poses, up against the history of art, which I do in my webinar lecture about the James Bond Doc Savage covers. So that's kind of an example
Yeah.
of how everything overlaps. The sources of my inspiration from my childhood are the very things that I put into my art and my books. I mean, my book about the Twilight Zone, my very first childhood image was that black and white eyeball in outer
Hmm.
space. And then I
Hmm.
ended up doing the first coffee table art book about the Twilight Zone that treats the photographic images light black and white art photography. That was
Love
one
it.
project. So, there's a great quote by Albert Camus that's a friend of mine gave me 15 years ago or so. And it said, a man's work is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened.
Nice, nice.
And
Love a
I
little
look at my
Camus.
career, absolutely. I look at my career and the works I've done and the works I'm doing as just feeding back the things that I loved and influenced me to become an artist, feeding them back through various genres, various things, like I said, whether it's books, whether it's lectures, but everything is really multi-platformable. All of my books are lectures. All of my lectures can become books.
Hmm.
And that's kind of, what I've done and what I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned Liechtenstein, so I thought I would show my Liechtenstein collection. It's pretty
Ah,
impressive here. These are United States stamps.
stamps. I
Yeah.
posted those on my Facebook group. Exactly.
Hmm.
Listen, I'm very pro Liechtenstein, but a lot of comic book people, as I call them, are anti-Liechtenstein. Oh, he ripped off the artist. Oh, he just traces the panels. Don't get me started.
Yeah, yeah.
I've done a webinar for New York Adventure Club, a company that I do webinars with every now and then, about the birth of pop culture and Roy Lichtenstein's work. And bottom line is, they're all still fighting the same arguments from 1965 that
Right,
have
right.
won for the last 60 years. And those stamps, I think I posted in my Facebook group, the Silver Age of Comic Art, with the tagline was, I think it was Liechtenstein triumphant.
Hmm.
To
Hmm.
all of his critics, which are still plentiful, because I get into Facebook fights with them all the time. But like I said, most comic book people, as I call them, are anti-Liechtenstein, but I love a good kerfuffle. I love a good brew. And that's also what social media is good for, because I'm unabashedly pro Liechtenstein.
Yes, yeah, yeah. But and it's funny what people rage about, being someone in the world of reading, their arguments there. I was going to mention, have you heard of a journal or checked out a journal called the International Journal of Comics Art by any chance?
I had an article in there called The Auteur Theory of Comics
Love it,
back
love it.
in 2011 or 12, based on the whole Jack Kirby versus Stan Lee, who
Hmm.
created what thing. I'm very pro Kirby. Of course, I run a Jack Kirby group on Facebook, but the Auteur Theory of Comics was a verbal visual essay, also available just as text, but it was basically built on the Auteur Theory of film,
Yeah.
that declared that the director, not the screenwriter who wrote the screenplay,
Mm-hmm.
is the auteur in French, of the work, because a screenplay, bottom line, is words on paper. They might read well, but a
Hmm.
director has to figure out how to make it into the art form called a film.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
is why, ever since the 50s, we've been calling a film by the director's possessive. Oh, it's a Scorsese film. Oh, it's a Fellini film. Oh, well,
Hmm. Hmm.
in comics, it's the auteur theory of comics. The artist, the illustrator, is the auteur of any comic reading experience, whether the writer wrote a full script, DC old school style,
Hmm.
panel one, Batman and Robin, see the bat signal, panel two, getting the Batmobile. Doesn't matter. Dick Sprang, a 1950s Batman artist, one of the greatest Batman artists of all time, he worked from complete scripts.
Yeah.
So we were able to recognize the Dick Sprang story from all the other hack Batman ghosts, because he auteured those stories that he drew. He
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
showing you the world of Dick Sprang via Dick Sprang's eyes.
Yeah.
There was a story called The Peril of Playland Isle that took place on a wooden roller coaster, like the old-fashioned ones at Coney Island.
Uh-huh.
Dick Sprang drew every single wooden slat of that roller coaster in panels this big that went to a vanishing point.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dick Sprang auteuring from a script. The great Alan Moore, the British author who wrote, Watchmen,
Hmm.
he famously wrote 26 pages of text describing one panel to give to probably Dave Gibbons, the artist of
Hmm.
Watchmen. Now, pro writers, people who are anti the auteur theory of comics and are pro Stan Lee usually, they say, well, hold on a second. If a writer tells an artist what to draw,
Hmm.
does that make the writer the creator? Guess what? It doesn't. Because if you gave those 26 pages of Alan Moore's script to 10 different artists, guess what,
It's
Jason?
different
You get
visions,
10
different.
different panels.
Yep.
So the artist is the auteur of comics. Okay, next subject. You like that?
But is that wrapped?
Yes. Next.
Curious about what draws you to the Silver Age.
Well, it's the era I grew up in, actually. I'm on the
Uh-huh.
tail end of the baby boom generation. So I was, 7.5 years old when the Batman TV show came out.
Love
I'm
it.
old
Love it.
enough to remember that. I'm old enough to be influenced by the great comic book artists of the Silver Age at DC Comics, Carmine Infantino, Gil Kane,
Hmm.
Murphy Anderson, guys like that. And then when Neil Adams came along in 1968 after the Batman TV show, he changed comic book art forever by bringing his photorealistic style into comics.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
he and Jim Steranko were like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones of comic book art in the late 60s. They were the twin gods.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm blessed enough to be able to say that I ended up working for Neil Adams after
Wow.
I got arts in the 80s. And Jim Steranko wanted me to leave RISD and work as his apprentice in Reading,
Nice.
Pennsylvania. I could have joined the circus, but I stayed at RISD and got my degree. My mom, may she rest in peace, was paying for college. I was in my junior year. But if he had contacted me about that in my freshman year, I might have left RISD and joined the circus. But I'm blessed to say I almost worked for Jim Steranko and I ended up working for Neil Adams. If you had told me when I was 12 years old in 1970, at the height of the Neil Adams is God kind of thing, that Arlen, one day you will be working for Neil Adams, you'll be penciling for him, and he'll be inking you. And one day, Arlen, people will look at your work and say, that reminds me of Neil Adams. I would have had an adolescent heart attack right there, Jason.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So I'm blessed to say that.
Very cool. Very cool. So what is it historically
Oh,
um
the silver.
that what marks that point? What
Oh,
says, okay, well, this is this age
right,
and now we're
right.
going there. Yeah.
Right. So basically, the 1940s, when superheroes and comic books as a medium were birthed with the creation of Superman in 38, followed by
Hmm.
Batman, Captain America, World War II, the glut of superheroes. That ended when the war ended, basically. By the 1950s, superheroes were gone. They were
Hmm.
replaced by crime comics, funny animals, westerns, echoes of television. And
Hmm.
DC Comics in the mid 50s, we don't really know who. Somebody said, hey, remember that character we used to publish back in the 40s, the Flash, the guy that ran fast? Let's bring him back. But here's the thing. In what has to be called the first pop culture reboot, Jason, they rebooted the Flash, but not the same looking character. They changed his costume.
Hmm.
He was a different person. And what would be revealed later it was two different Earths, Earth One, Earth Two, the whole multiverse. So the debut of the Flash in 1956, even though he didn't get his own regular title until 3 years later in 59, that is looked back on as historians as the beginning of the Silver Age, as distinct from the Golden Age when superheroes died by the 1950.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
so starting in 1956 up to, I always say, circa 1970, a lot of things happened in 1970, comic book history wise, that to me make it a legitimate ending of eras. But that's what historians do.
Hmm.
After
Hmm.
a certain number of time has passed, you look back and, the 60s didn't really begin until Kennedy was assassinated. And the 60s ended when Nixon resigned. So that was the 11 years, but they overlap the 60s and into the 70s when you really look at what the quote 60s were.
So, last official question, and then we can hit anything that we've missed, and that is what stories, worlds, artistic visions are currently inspiring you? What are the next creative directions?
Well, I am also blessed to be able to say that I will be getting not just one, but two books published of my two other areas of deep interest that I mentioned before, Bruce Springsteen and the Twilight Zone, by the pop culture publisher Bear Manor Media. And I just have them as my PDF printouts now. But one is called The Five Themes of the Twilight Zone, which are episode essays that, believe it or not, I've been writing on and off for the last 32 years, ever since the publication of my coffee table art book, Visions for the Twilight Zone. By the way, when you lift up the dust jacket, remember the first image of the child? I got it embossed. So this book's out of print, but if you find it on eBay or on, through Google, it's worth it to get the hardcover as a limited edition. But basically, ever since I did this book, which, like I said, treated the television images as black and white art photography and the dialogue and narration like poetry. So you see that? This is the comeuppance awaiting every man when the ledger of his life is opened and examined. And that was dialogue or narration. So ever since this was published in 1991, I've been writing episode essays about my favorite episodes. They started out as capsule descriptions, and then over time, they became rich enough to pull them together in book form. And I noticed that Bear Manor Media had published other books about the Twilight Zone, like the collected scripts of Charles Beaumont and Rod Serling and things like that. And sure enough, they went for this. So I'm very harsh when it comes to the things I love. I'm as critical as I am laudatory. So out of the 156 episodes of the Twilight Zone, over half of them are dogs, in my opinion. I ended up writing essays about 68 of the 156 episodes. Now, the way I defend that in my introduction in the book is that it's like a batter in baseball batting 400. 400 is a great batting average. 68 out of 156, I think, is 0.429. So that's a good batting. Listen, weekly television, anthology television, the Twilight Zone didn't have it easy where you had the same set every week and the same characters. It was anthology. Every episode was different every week. So I cut the Twilight Zone some slack. But as a pop culture historian, by not only writing only about 68 episodes, but by calling it the Five Themes of the Twilight Zone, I looked at Serling's and the other writers' works like Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, and I realized that there were five themes: science and superstition, suburban nightmares, the time element, a question of identity. And I always forget one. I'm sure it'll come to me. The point I guess I'm trying to make is that by grouping them in themes and showing you how even the other writers, like Matheson and Beaumont, were writing under Serling's overarching themes, I'm, as an historian, basically trying to make a consensus. Not all 156 episodes were great, even though in this social media age with all the Twilight Zone fan groups, my worst episode is somebody's favorite and vice versa.
Right.
But by not writing about every episode, which maybe you would expect, a book of essays about the Twilight Zone, I hope they wrote about my favorite episode. Guess what? I didn't. I wrote about my favorite episodes because I'm trying to make a consensus and say these are the greatest episodes because these are the episodes I chose to write about. And if you
Hmm.
disagree with my list, be my guest. That's why
Write your
there's
own essay.
and that's why there's well, but that's why there's different books and different historians
Hmm.
about different things and different points of view. But I'm making an indirect statement by saying these are the greatest episodes of this anthology series. And this is why they're great. Because if you
Hmm.
read my perspective on them as both a fan and as an artist and graphic designer and historian, I'm watching every episode with three different points of view about the episode.
Hmm.
And I write about it and I just let it all flow. So for the expert on the Twilight Zone that has watched every episode 1,000 times, like many of us have, even for them, I might give them a perspective on that episode that maybe they never thought about.
Hmm.
I might
Hmm.
make them feel something about an episode they never felt something about. And that's a victory. That's the whole point. So
Absolutely.
I'm really excited. This is going to come out sometime in 2024. And then there's my book of liner notes, as I call them, to Bruce Springsteen's greatest unreleased material. Unless you're a diehard Bruce fan, you might not realize Bruce has a volume of unreleased material, just like Neil Young does, just like Bob Dylan does, the Grateful Dead. Uh, and yet, even though Bruce has released in the last 15 years 2 different box sets, he's still left a volume of material off. But here's the thing, nobody's ever written about these unreleased material songs. Even Bruce himself, when he put out those box sets, there are no liner notes by him.
Hmm.
So I've been writing these since 1998, 25 years on and off.
Wow.
And
Wow.
I decided to pull them together in a book. And since Bear Manor Media publishes pop culture books from A to Z, they publish plenty of books about music. They have a book coming out about the Beatles in the 60s and whatever. And sure enough, they want to publish this too. I call it
Nice.
Brilliant Disguise because when you read my liner notes, which are organized chronologically by his career, I've given you through the liner notes an alternate history of Bruce Springsteen that overlaps with his official history and yet doesn't. It's
Hmm.
almost like there are two Bruce Springsteens, the one he's chosen to present officially, and then there's this other Bruce Springsteen who's similar but different. And
Hmm.
sometimes could he even be better? That is the great question that I pose to you. But just like the Twilight Zone, people have written plenty of books about Bruce Springsteen. I've got 2 shelves of them.
Hmm.
Trust me, nobody has written not only about his unreleased music like I have, but nobody has written about his songs the way I've written about these liner notes that give you a whole new way of appreciating and looking at Bruce's career. So
Hmm.
once again, even the diehard fan, if they don't know this material, even if they know the songs, they're all available on YouTube now. But my liner notes will put all of those songs on YouTube in context that you've never read before from any other author about Bruce Springsteen going on the last 40 years or so. And I can only say that because I have every book about Bruce Springsteen. But this book will be a way of looking at Bruce's career that I promise you, when you read some of my interpretations of these songs, will, again, the expert on Bruce will think of them in a different way, even if they know the songs. And the average Bruce fan will get a whole new way of looking at it. But Brilliant Disguise, one of his greatest songs, of course, actually is a perfect title because that's what he's done.
Hmm.
His disguised material, meaning officially unreleased, is actually in disguise as maybe his greatest material.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So I'm really, and this again will be out sometime in 2024. Both of these books go into production this fall, and I'll know more about their release dates. But so that's what's upcoming. And I'm very excited for that because I haven't been published really in 20 years, Jason. My book on the Silver Age came out originally in '03. It went
Hmm.
out in '05, and then I brought a revised edition out in 2014. And people can still order that book for me to sign it and sketch in it for them, through my website, and I'm sure you'll give all the links. But I'm
Hmm.
really looking forward to 2024 to finally have two new books about, again, my two other areas of interest. And I'm actually waiting to hear on maybe a third book about the great DC Comics letterer Ira Schnapp, the guy that created not only the DC Bullet and the Comics Code seal,
Uh-huh.
but designed the Superman logo and lettered every DC Comics logo that you could think of for 30 years that spanned 1938 to 1968. The Flash, Aquaman, every logo you can think of is Ira Schnapp. But he also
Nice.
designed the Roman numeral, the Roman letters on top of Penn Station, neither rain nor sleet nor snow.
Ah.
When he was a teenager after coming to America from Austria, like so many immigrant Jewish families did at the turn of the century. And when he was a teenager, he drew out those Roman letters for the stone carvers to etch. So the average person, Jason, doesn't know that the
Hmm.
guy who designed those Roman letters that are still there at Penn Station post office is the same guy that refined what I call the Coca-Cola of comic book logos, the Superman logo, and
Hmm.
every logo you could think of. And I did a coffee table kind of monograph on him. And if all goes well, I'm waiting to hear even that might get published, which, are you kidding me? That's like winning the trifecta or making a triple play. Like my cup runneth over already that I'm getting two published, but we'll see.
Ah.
Um, that'll be my area of comic book history interest. So Bruce Springsteen, Twilight Zone, comic book history. Those are my three areas of play.
Love it. Love it. Looking forward to it, and very cool insights. You mentioned the Facebook groups. You have a website. Anywhere else where listeners can connect?
Well, so my website, arlenschumer.com, but make sure you spell it right. SC,
Hmm.
just like Chuck and Amy Schumer. I'm the unknown Schumer. I'm the third Schumer. I'm hoping to get onto their level. And yeah, on Facebook, I don't hide behind any pseudonyms. On Instagram, Twitter, whatever it's called now, X, uh,
Hmm.
Tumblr, I'm just Arlen Schumer. So, but I'm mostly on Facebook because I get the most feedback, even though it's
Hmm.
never enough for me. I don't get enough feedback on Instagram or Twitter, but I do get feedback on Facebook. So I run three comics history groups: the Silver Age of Comic Art, Jack Kirby and Company, devoted to his work, and Neil Adams, the Neil Adams Almanac. So that keeps me busy social media wise. And
Awesome.
but you got to Facebook friend me first, or however it works. But yeah, I believe that my comics history groups are the best comics history groups that I could see on Facebook or anywhere. I've actually inspired a lot of other groups to do kind of the area that I do, but what can I do? That's what happens when you're good. People imitate you. So imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Isn't that an expression?
That's an expression. Yeah.
Well, I'm living it, baby. Anyway, that should be the worst of my problems, by the way. Or the least of my problems? The least, the worst? I forget. If
Yeah.
if only that were the worst of my problems.
There you go. There you go. All right. Well, thank you so much, Arlen. Thank you for taking some time to talk with me, and glad to share. And yeah, thanks for answering the bat signal.
Jason, thanks for having me, man. This has been fabulous.
Yeah, great to talk with you, and I'll send links back around to you.
You got it. Take care.
You too. Thanks.
Have a great rest of the summer.
You too.